Good evening, everybody. James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 3 of season 5 of Better Call Saul, an episode called The Guy for This. I thought this was a very solid episode, and I almost missed the last couple scenes because when 10 o'clock rolled around, thought the episode was over. I rolled over to my computer, and I just had the TV playing in case there was a teaser, and suddenly there was like 15 more minutes of scenes. So thankfully, I stuck around for the end, which I thought was fantastic. So if you almost made the same mistake that I did, definitely bail out now because I will be going into spoilers. And I have a feeling this episode is going to generate a ton of chatter because Dean Norris was back as Hank. Now, that had been spoiled for me ahead of time because I saw this interview earlier today on USA Today talking all about his return. But I imagine there are a lot of Breaking Bad fanatics out there who were not aware of his return, who completely lost their minds when they saw Dean Norris step into frame. And Dean Norris is one of those actors who's been around for forever. When I was a kid, I saw him in movies like Total Recall or T2 or Last Seduction. And he was never a massive star, but he was always around. He was always popping up in cool flicks like Lethal Weapon 2 and things like that. But obviously in Breaking Bad, he really got to show off his chops. So I'm thrilled that he's back for not only this episode, as well as the next. But I just want to share with you a few quick details from this exclusive on USA Today, where Dean Norris says, "I told producers it's going to be fun to play Hank before all the depression, before he took a turn for the worse. You know, the loudmouth, strong, tough, not a care in the world kind of guy that I only got to play in the first 2 seasons. What's interesting, though, is how it created a bit of a narrative issue going into this because the writers on the show weren't entirely sure if the interactions between Saul Goodman and Hank on Breaking Bad were their first encounter or perhaps one of many encounters. And apparently writer and producer Peter Gould went back and watched some of those old episodes several times over, and he says, when we watched it, it felt like these two guys had engaged before, that they didn't particularly like each other. And apparently Better Call Saul has one writer whose job it is to rewatch all 62 episodes of Breaking Bad before the start of production of each season, just to make sure that there are no narrative inconsistencies between Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. And Vince Gilligan added, "It's like doing a Rubik's Cube, and I've never finished a Rubik's Cube. Peter and I foolishly thought it'd be easier to do a spin-off series because so much was already in place, but that only makes it harder because you have to match things to the pre-existing series." And the last bit I'll share is that they promise that there'll be a few more familiar faces from Breaking Bad later in the season as well as in season 6. Also, for those of you out there who are Better Call Saul fanatics, I strongly recommend the Better Call Saul Insider podcast. They post a new interview after each episode of the show, and if you really want to get into the weeds on the nuts and bolts of producing, creating, writing, editing a show, it's absolutely essential listening because I feel like so many podcasts about shows and movies, they're talking about them strictly from a narrative point of view, but you really get a sense of how the sausage is made by listening to the show. But there's also some funny bits in there as well, like when Jonathan Banks talks about using sock garters to hold his socks up back in the day, or people telling anecdotes about Tony Dalton, who plays Lalo Salamanca, who apparently is funny as hell and just an absolute joy to work with. In any event, with all that out of the way, let's dive into this latest episode where we really got to see the beginning of Saul Goodman's association with Lalo. And if you remember way back in Breaking Bad, there's one episode where Jimmy was screaming out in panic about a character named Lalo, who at the time hadn't really been fleshed out or written or cast or anything. But now we're starting to see what drove him to fear this character so intensely. And as great as this episode was in terms of plot, what I loved was that it had many sequences with purely visual storytelling, which is usually more like the hallmark of movies, whereas TV is very narrative-driven, very script-driven. But this episode had several remarkable sequences without a single word spoken. Case in point is the image of the ice cream cone, which we see at the beginning of the episode and toward the end, where it's been casually discarded by Jimmy at the end of last episode. But we see one ant coming out. We get all these great extreme close-ups. The ant discovers this source of fuel. We see more ants coming out, and slowly but surely they just swarm over this ice cream cone. And toward the end, when Jimmy sees it again, he sees that it's been totally devoured. Now, you could obviously interpret that visual metaphor however you like, but for me, it was a sign that whether he likes it or not, slowly but surely, Saul Goodman is going to be eaten alive like a big scoop of ice cream by this Mexican drug cartel. But another great visual sequence, which had been teased extensively leading up to the release of this season, was watching Jimmy in the back of Nacho's car, just taking in all the details, the fact that he can't lock or unlock the door manually, the guns that are casually on display. And Bob Odenkirk, he's such a comedic genius that I can't help but laugh whenever I see him performing. However, I don't think he gets nearly the credit he deserves. It's just being a great dramatic actor. We're just so familiar with his comedic chops that it's hard not just to laugh in joy while watching him perform as he eases back in the seat and just kind of hunkers down for the rest of the ride. And the last great sequence that relied purely on visual storytelling without a word of dialogue is at the very end, where Kim comes back from an exhausting day of trying to convince Mr. Acker to leave his land voluntarily. And all of a sudden she pulls into her parking spot and she hears a little whistle from Jimmy upstairs. She goes up there, he lights her a smoke, they open a few beers, and they just start relaxing, passing the cigarette back and forth. And honestly, dialogue would have completely spoiled the sequence because we see just what an incredible rapport they have. And of course, Kim starts smashing beer bottles. Jimmy's delighted. He joins in on the fun. They destroy the six-pack. And I love how when the neighbors start taking notice of all the noise outside, they sneak inside giggling like little kids. And I know for a lot of people, especially the writers working on this show, they talk about how Jimmy's such a bad influence on Kim and that slowly but surely he's kind of chipping away at her soul. However, she clearly loves and adores him, and clearly he allows her to express the side of her personality that ordinarily she would not express otherwise. So while he might sometimes bring out the worst in her in terms of lying to her clients, he obviously brings a lot of joy into her life as well. So it's sequences like these scattered throughout the episode that I feel like set Better Call Saul light years beyond so many other shows that are more than happy just to operate within the realm of conventional television. So as impressive as that might be with the writing staff's ability to write scenes that are totally free of dialogue, this episode also has a lot of really juicy scenes where the characters are interacting verbally as well. And the first one is when we see Saul Goodman, Lalo, and Nacho having a little negotiation about Saul Goodman coming on the payroll. And I love how Lalo, he could just as easily be the star of the show and be a comedic powerhouse in his own right. However, he's playing the bad guy, he's playing the heavy. But there's something about the way he carries himself that makes me laugh with pleasure almost as frequently as I do while watching Bob Odenkirk in action. But Lalo's plan is that since Crazy 8 has already been arrested, he might as well use that to provide information that'll end up hurting Gus, who obviously Lalo's not the world's biggest fan of. Which leads to the scene that Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul fans are going to completely freak out about, where we see Hank and Saul Goodman basically indulging in some good old-fashioned horse trading as both of them try to work out the best possible deal about what's going to happen with Crazy 8 moving forward. And initially, Saul Goodman, he's in character. He's kind of acting like a clown. He's very deliberately saying silly things that blur the lines between the DEA and the FBI. But I like how Hank is not too quick to be taken in, and he immediately calls bullshit and he threatens to walk out. So there's a bit of a performative aspect to both characters as they negotiate. And finally, they settle on an arrangement where Crazy 8 will be a confidential informant to Hank moving forward, and all the charges against Crazy 8 will be dropped if these dead drops where $500,000 in drug money has been stashed lead to actual arrests. And when Jimmy goes to Lalo to report the final result of his negotiations, I love how we get this great killer shot of Jimmy and Nacho just chilling there side by side on Nacho's car as Lalo is just driving around like a bat out of hell on this dirt track. And it was just such a cool study in contrast seeing Nacho and Jimmy side by side, who through no fault of their own are now trapped working for this horrible guy Lalo. And when Saul Goodman tries to demur from doing any additional work for Lalo in the future, Lalo kind of laughs it off, and Nacho tells him the regrettable news: when you're in, you're in. And it's immediately after that Jimmy sees the melted ice cream cone with all the ants feeding on it, which seems to reflect exactly how he feels. But Nacho's not necessarily in a much better position. So far, he's been able to successfully play both sides against one another. He goes to Gus and informs him about the upcoming raid on his 3 dead drops, but Gus allows it to happen because he doesn't want Lalo to know that Nacho is informing him about what's going on the other side. And Nacho's starting to get a lot of pushback from his father, who comes to see him and basically calls him out on the fact that Nacho's basically been urging Gutierrez to buy out Nacho's father so that he'll leave and be safe, but his father's having none of it and basically tells Nacho that he should go to the police and that he plans on going nowhere. Sadly, we don't get a lot of Jonathan Banks this episode, but what we get is pretty solid. We see him getting absolutely wasted at a bar. He's getting mean drunk, and as he's walking away from the bar, he walks by these youths that are hanging out in the front yard. They accost him, they ask him for some money. He ends up talking a little trash. One of them punches him in the face, whereupon he basically grabs him by the wrist and then shoves him down and either dislocates his shoulder or breaks his arm. But Mike's a total savage, and he's only becoming more savage as he slowly but surely descends into the dark side. He's one of many characters this season who seems to be at war within their own soul over the direction their life should take. And Kim's in a similar situation as well. Does her heart belong to the money and success promised by Mesa Verde, or will she find more fulfillment doing these pro bono cases because she's basically ordered to get down to Tucumcari, where this old fellow's refusing to leave his home, even though technically the letter of the law is against him? In his original lease, it was basically stated that the land could be sold out anytime, and Kim does everything in her power to try to encourage him to move to a new place where he will not only own the house as well as the land, and she even offers to pay for his moving fees. But you can tell that she's starting to feel pretty rotten about some of the hatchet jobs that she's having to do on behalf of Mesa Verde. In any event, as far as this season is concerned, I think so far it's batting 3 for 3. I've loved all 3 episodes. This was yet another example of why Better Call Saul is one of the best written, best acted, and best directed shows on TV. Why it's not everybody's favorite show, I'm not entirely sure. I have other shows that I like along the same level, shows like Succession. I'm hoping Westworld Season 3 will be good. I'm really looking forward to Dark Season 3. But there's something about Better Call Saul where just the writing and the acting and the directing are so goddamn solid and consistent that I know every single episode is either going to be good or great. But in every single season of Better Call Saul so far, I can't even remember a single episode that has disappointed me. Like, try to remember the last time you were watching a show where every single episode you enjoyed. It almost never happens. Inevitably, you come across one episode, you're like, they kind of dropped the ball, but hopefully they'll bounce back next time, or hopefully they'll bounce back next season. The team behind this show, they're what television is all about. So once again, I strongly urge everybody to check out Better Call Saul Insider, because you really get a chance to get to know the cast and crew, the writers and editors who make this show the success that it is. So I think I've rambled enough at this point. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. But let me know what you think in the comments below, or hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrex. But I can't thank you enough for watching the video. If you enjoyed the reaction and review, please consider subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. I would really appreciate it. But until next time, onwards and upwards.